May 16th, 2010. Houston Methodist Hospital. The machines beeped their mechanical rhythm as Ronnie James Dio, the man who had transformed heavy metal into living mythology, drew his final breath at age 67. Outside, thousands of fans gathered in spontaneous vigil, raising the devil horns high into the Texas sky. That legendary gesture he had transformed from his Italian grandmother's protective charm into the universal symbol of an entire culture. This was the man who had breathed new life into Black Sabbath after Ozzy's departure, who had built the kingdom of Dio with Holy Diver, who had written Heaven and Hell like an oath of immortality. But now, that very voice, the one that could soar across 4 octaves and make dragons seem real, was being strangled by a disease that no hero, no magic, no amount of determination could defeat. The world wept. From Tony Iommi choking back tears to Ozzy Osbourne admitting we lost one of the great voices. Dio didn't just die, he became legend, and the question that echoes through every concert hall where metalheads still raise their horns: how did such a small man leave such a giant echo in the universe of metal? How does someone who stood barely 5 feet 4 inches cast a shadow that reaches across generations? The answer lies not in his size, but in the dragons he chose to battle, and the final dragon that no sword could slay. But to understand how the boy who trembled at school bullies became the voice that conquered darkness itself, we must journey back to where it all began, to the industrial shadows of upstate New York, where a child named 1942, Ronald James Padavona, first discovered that the smallest bodies can harbor the most titanic dreams. Cortland, New York, a factory town where dreams went to die, choked by smoke and the grinding rhythm of honest desperation. Into this gray world came Ronald James Padavona, born to Italian-American parents who carried the old country superstitions like precious cargo. His father, Patrick's hands bore the permanent stains of the iron foundry, while his mother, Anna, filled their modest home with opera records and the aromatic promises of traditional cooking. But it was Nonna, grandmother, who unknowingly planted the seeds of a global phenomenon. She was a keeper of ancient wisdom, her weathered fingers constantly weaving protective gestures against the evil eye. Young Ronald watched, mesmerized, as she formed a specific hand sign whenever darkness threatened. Index and pinky fingers extended, thumb holding down the middle fingers. Corna, she called it, protection against the devil himself. The boy who would become Dio was marked as different from his earliest breath. While neighborhood children played war games in the streets, Ronald retreated into worlds of fantasy literature and his mother's soaring opera recordings. Caruso's voice, thundering from the old Victrola, seemed to speak directly to something deep within his chest, a resonance that would later transform into the most recognizable voice in heavy metal. At school, Ronald's diminutive stature, he would never grow beyond 5 feet 4 inches, made him an easy target for bullies. They called him names, pushed him around, mocked his love of books and classical music. But when forced to defend himself, something extraordinary happened. His voice, even in anger, carried a power that seemed impossible given his physical size. Teachers began to notice. During school assemblies, they would place little Ronald at the back of the choir, assuming his voice would blend into the background. Instead, it soared above every other sound, carrying a clarity and strength that silenced rooms. The transformation was most evident during a Christmas pageant when Ronald was 12. Assigned a minor role as a shepherd, he was given one line to sing, but as his voice filled the auditorium, pure, powerful, otherworldly, the entire production stopped. Parents leaned forward in their seats. Teachers exchanged glances. In that moment, Ronald James Padavona glimpsed his destiny. He could command dragons with his voice, even if his fists couldn't command bullies. Could these early experiences of feeling small in body but giant in spirit have shaped the fantasy warrior he would become? The signs were undeniable. Ronald began approaching music not as entertainment but as armor against a world that judged him by his size. He formed his first band, the Vegas Kings, while still in high school. The name itself a declaration that he intended to rule something, somewhere. But the real dragon he was preparing to battle wasn't external. It was the voice inside every small person that whispers, "You don't belong here." Ronald's grandmother had given him the protective gesture. His mother had given him the love of soaring voices, but he would have to forge his own sword. That weapon would be his voice, and the battlefield would be every stage he ever stepped upon. The late 1960s found Ronald, now calling himself Ronnie, wielding that voice weapon in increasingly larger battles. His band Elf represented his first serious campaign in the war for musical recognition, but success in the music industry proved to be a different kind of dragon entirely. Record contracts were designed to devour young artists, and Elf found themselves trapped in deals that left them washing dishes between gigs just to survive. Yet these grinding years forged something essential in Ronnie's character. While contemporaries viewed rock music as a path to quick fame and fortune, he approached it like a medieval knight approaching a quest. His lyrics began incorporating fantasy themes not as escapism, but as metaphors for the very real battles facing anyone who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. Dragons represented the obstacles that tried to keep dreamers small. Wizards embodied the power that came from mastering one's craft. Warriors were simply people who refused to surrender. The breakthrough came through Ritchie Blackmore, the virtuoso guitarist whose band Deep Purple had helped define hard rock. When Blackmore heard Elf perform, he was struck not just by Ronnie's 4-octave range, but by his ability to inhabit the characters his songs described. Here was a vocalist who didn't just sing about fantasy, he became it. The invitation to join Blackmore's new band, Rainbow, represented everything Ronnie had fought toward, but it also meant abandoning the musical family he had struggled with for years. Rainbow's Rising album in 1976 announced the arrival of something unprecedented in rock music. Songs like Stargazer weren't just heavy metal tracks, they were epic poems set to thunderous music, with Ronnie's voice serving as narrator, hero, and Greek chorus simultaneously. The 8-minute opus told the story of a wizard building a tower to the stars, while enslaved masses toiled below, but anyone paying attention could hear the real story. The struggle of any artist trying to reach impossible heights while the world tries to keep them grounded. A Light in the Black continued this theme, with Ronnie's voice painting vast sonic landscapes where good and evil battled for the souls of mortals. But perhaps most revealing was Stargazer's central image, a small figure reaching toward infinity, determined to touch the stars despite overwhelming odds. It was Ronald Padavona's life story disguised as fantasy epic. The success brought its own dragons to battle. Blackmore's perfectionism bordered on obsession, and recording sessions became psychological warfare zones where every note was fought over. Ronnie's classical training served him well. He could match Blackmore's technical knowledge and maintain professionalism under extreme pressure, but the cost was enormous. Friends watched him become more withdrawn, more focused on his craft at the expense of personal relationships. Was the artistic growth worth the personal sacrifice? 3 albums with Rainbow established Ronnie as one of rock's premier vocalists, but they also revealed the limitations of being someone else's voice rather than his own vision. The fantasy themes that would later define his solo career were already evident, but they existed within the constraints of Blackmore's musical preferences. Ronnie was learning to slay dragons, but he was fighting other people's wars. The lessons learned during the Rainbow Years proved invaluable when opportunity knocked in the form of a phone call that would change heavy metal history forever. Black Sabbath, the band that had essentially created the genre, was in crisis following Ozzy Osbourne's departure, and they needed someone who could both honor their legacy and chart a new course for their future. 1979. The call came on a rain-soaked evening in Los Angeles. Tony Iommi's voice heavy with exhaustion and desperate hope. Black Sabbath, the creators of heavy metal itself, stood at the edge of dissolution. Ozzy's increasing unreliability had finally forced the painful decision to find a new vocalist. But how do you replace someone who had become synonymous with the band's identity? How do you find a voice powerful enough to fill the void left by the Prince of Darkness himself? For Ronnie, the offer represented both vindication and the ultimate test. At 37, he was no longer a young artist with unlimited chances. This was his opportunity to prove that the small man with the giant voice could not only match the legendary Ozzy, but elevate Black Sabbath to new heights. The first meeting with Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward took place at Criteria Studios in Miami, and the chemistry was immediate. Ronnie's classical training allowed him to match the complexity of Iommi's riffs, while his fantasy-oriented lyrics provided perfect complement to Sabbath's apocalyptic imagery. But more than musical compatibility, Ronnie brought something Sabbath desperately needed: hope. Where Ozzy's vocals had often conveyed despair and chaos, Ronnie's voice carried the promise that darkness could be conquered. His interpretation of heavy metal wasn't about surrendering to evil. It was about finding the strength to fight it. This philosophical difference would reshape not just Black Sabbath, but the entire genre. Heaven and Hell, the album that announced this new era, became nothing less than a resurrection. The title track served as Ronnie's mission statement, his voice soaring over Iommi's crushing riffs as he sang of battles between light and darkness, of choosing sides in cosmic wars. But the real message was more personal. This small man was declaring war on every force that tried to keep dreamers small. Neon Nights continued the theme, with Ronnie's vocals painting images of warriors riding through neon-lit urban landscapes, fantasy heroes in a modern world. The album's success vindicated everyone involved, but it also created new pressures that few could understand. Every review, every interview, every fan interaction included comparisons to Ozzy. The question wasn't whether the new material was good, it was whether it was really Black Sabbath. Ronnie handled these comparisons with remarkable grace, consistently expressing respect for Ozzy's contributions while maintaining confidence in his own vision. But friends noted the toll it was taking. The Heaven and Hell tour revealed the full extent of Ronnie's transformation from hired gun to commanding presence. His stage performance turned Sabbath concerts from the occasionally chaotic spectacles of the Ozzy years into precisely crafted theatrical experiences. The devil horns gesture, which he had learned from his grandmother decades earlier, it became his signature move, a way of connecting with audiences while honoring his Italian heritage. Behind all that on-stage power, was there a loneliness that few could see? Those closest to Ronnie during this period noticed subtle changes. The man who had always been generous and optimistic became more guarded, more careful about trust. The pressure of representing both himself and Black Sabbath's legacy created internal conflicts he rarely discussed publicly. He was acutely aware that many fans viewed him as temporary, keeping Ozzy's seat warm until the real singer returned. The follow-up album, Mob Rules, pushed the boundaries even further. Songs like Turn Up the Night and the title track showcased Ronnie's ability to make Sabbath's heaviness more melodic without sacrificing power. But perhaps most significant was The Sign of the Southern Cross, an epic that seemed to synthesize everything he had learned about combining classical composition techniques with metal's raw energy. His voice on this track didn't just sing the lyrics, it became the wind, the darkness, the hope struggling against despair. Yet even as artistic success mounted, internal tensions were building. The original members' sense of ownership over the Sabbath legacy created friction that no amount of commercial vindication could resolve. Creative disagreements escalated during the Mob Rules sessions, and by 1982 it became clear that this marriage of convenience had run its course. Did this split mark his downfall, or simply prepare him for his greatest triumph? Ronnie's departure from Black Sabbath could have ended his career at the highest level. Instead, it freed him to become the artist he had always been meant to be. At 40, he made the boldest decision of his life. He would create his own kingdom, where the small man's giant voice would bow to no one else's vision. The formation of Dio in 1982 represented more than a new band. It was Ronald James Padavona's final transformation into the mythical figure he had been building his entire life. For the first time since his teenage years with Elf, he would have complete creative control. The question was whether audiences would follow him into this new realm, where the Italian-American kid from Cortland would finally become the wizard he had always sung about. Assembling the right warriors for this musical crusade required finding musicians who understood that they weren't just forming another rock band. They were creating a mythology. Vivian Campbell's guitar work needed to match both Blackmore's complexity and Iommi's power while bringing his own voice to the conversation. Jimmy Bain and Vinnie Appice had to provide a rhythm section capable of supporting increasingly sophisticated compositions, while maintaining the raw energy that made metal compelling. The recording of Holy Diver at Sound City Studios became Ronnie's most personal artistic statement. Every song reflected decades of accumulated wisdom about the intersection of fantasy and reality. The title track served as his manifesto. The story of a mystical figure emerging from underwater depths could be read as autobiography disguised as mythology. Ronnie himself was the holy diver, emerging from the depths of other people's bands to claim his own artistic territory. Rainbow in the Dark addressed the isolation that accompanies true artistic vision. The lyrics spoke of being alone in a crowd, of seeing light where others see only darkness, themes that resonated with anyone who had ever felt different or misunderstood. But Ronnie's vocal performance transformed these potentially depressing concepts into anthems of empowerment. His voice didn't plead for acceptance. It demanded recognition. "Stand up and shout" became the rallying cry for everyone who had ever been told they were too small, too weird, too different to matter. When Ronnie sang "Stand Up and Shout," his 4-octave range made the command impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a song, it was a spell, cast by a wizard who had learned to transform his own insecurities into weapons of inspiration. The album's success vindicated every decision Ronnie had made. Holy Diver became one of the defining albums of the 1980s metal, proving that fantasy themes could be both commercially successful and artistically sophisticated. The music video, featuring Ronnie as a mysterious figure emerging from water while a robed villain menaced a young man, established visual motifs that would define his entire solo career. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Dio's success was how it completed Ronnie's personal mythology. He had transformed from Ronald, the picked-on kid from Cortland, into Dio, the voice that could make dragons seem real. The devil horn's gesture, inherited from his grandmother, became the universal symbol of his artistic kingdom. Fans worldwide adopted not just his music but his entire worldview. The belief that small people could achieve giant things if they refused to surrender to the forces trying to keep them down. The Holy Diver Tour revealed the full extent of this transformation. Ronnie's stage presence had evolved from impressive to mesmerizing. He moved with the confidence of someone who finally had complete control over his artistic vision, and audiences responded with enthusiasm that surpassed even his most successful periods with previous bands. The devil horns appeared in every crowd, creating a visual symbol of unity between performer and audience. Can anyone truly escape the shadow of their greatest triumph? The success of Holy Diver created new pressures and expectations that would define the rest of Ronnie's career. Follow-up albums like The Last in Line and Sacred Heart maintained his artistic standards while exploring new aspects of his fantasy-reality synthesis. But they also revealed the challenge of constantly having to top himself. The late 1980s and 1990s brought changes to both the music industry and Ronnie's personal circumstances that would test everything he had learned about adaptation and integrity. MTV's dominance meant that visual presentation became as important as musical content, while the rise of hair metal offered a more superficial version of the heavy sound he had helped create. Alternative rock was beginning to challenge metal's cultural relevance, questioning the very premises upon which his career had been built. More personally challenging was the physical toll of maintaining his intense performance schedule well into his 50s. The voice that had been his primary weapon for decades required increasingly careful management, and the athletic stage performances that had defined his live shows became more difficult to sustain night after night. Yet Ronnie refused to compromise his standards or reduce his commitment to giving audiences the full experience they expected. The death of his friend and former Black Sabbath drummer Cozy Powell in 1998 forced Ronnie to confront his own mortality and consider what he wanted his ultimate legacy to be. Powell had been more than just a musician. He had been a kindred spirit who understood the intersection of technical excellence and artistic passion that defined the best heavy metal. His loss reminded Ronnie that time was finite, and that the dragons he chose to battle in his remaining years would determine how he would be remembered. The reunion with Black Sabbath in 2006, performing under the name Heaven and Hell to distinguish it from Ozzy-era lineups, represented both homecoming and vindication. The chemistry that had made Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules classics was still intact. And new material like The Devil Cried proved that the combination of Ronnie's vocals and Tony Iommi's guitar work remained as powerful as ever. But the reunion also highlighted how much had changed in the intervening years. The music industry had been revolutionized by digital technology and changing consumer habits. The kind of career Ronnie had built, based on album sales and extensive touring, was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. More troubling were the subtle changes in his voice, which, while still powerful, no longer possessed the unlimited range and stamina of his younger years. The recording of Heaven and Hell's The Devil You Know album in 2009 became a race against time that none of the participants fully understood. Ronnie's stomach problems, manageable for years, were beginning to affect his energy levels and overall health. But his commitment to musical excellence remained absolute, and his vocal performances on tracks like Bible Black demonstrated that his artistic vision remained undimmed, even as his physical capabilities faced new limitations. Were these final creative efforts acts of defiance against mortality, or desperate attempts to complete unfinished business? Those who worked with Ronnie during this period noticed his increasing sense of urgency about completing projects and preserving his legacy. The man who had spent his career singing about immortal battles seemed to understand that his own time was running short. The cancer diagnosis in late 2009 came as a shock despite months of symptoms. The man who had spent his career conquering imaginary dragons suddenly faced an enemy that couldn't be defeated through determination and artistic vision alone. His initial response, characteristically, was to view the cancer as just another obstacle to overcome, the final boss in his life's epic quest. The final months revealed depths of character that decades of public performance had only hinted at. Despite pain and uncertainty, Ronnie remained focused on completing musical projects and maintaining the relationships that had sustained him throughout his career. His final recordings, made during chemotherapy treatments, showed no diminishment of his commitment to excellence. The end came more quickly than anyone expected. On May 16, 2010, Ronnie James Dio passed away at Houston Methodist Hospital, surrounded by family and friends who had watched him battle cancer with the same determination he had brought to every aspect of his career. The official cause of death was complications from stomach cancer. But the real loss was immeasurable: the silencing of one of rock's most distinctive and powerful voices. The news spread across the globe within hours, generating an outpouring of grief that transcended musical genres and geographic boundaries. Fans gathered at record stores, concert venues, and online communities to share memories and celebrate a legacy that had touched millions of lives. The devil horns appeared everywhere, from corporate boardrooms to elementary school playgrounds, as people who had never heard Ronnie's music mimicked the gesture their older siblings taught them. But perhaps the most telling tributes came from fellow musicians across all genres. Tony Iommi called him one of the nicest people you could ever meet. Rob Halford of Judas Priest described him as a true gentleman of heavy metal. Even artists outside the metal community acknowledged his influence on their understanding of how powerful vocals could elevate and transform heavy music. What made these tributes particularly meaningful was their focus on Ronnie as a person, rather than just a performer. Stories emerged of his kindness to young musicians, his professionalism during difficult sessions, and his genuine concern for fans who approached him at shows. The image that emerged was of someone who had maintained his humanity despite decades in an industry that often rewards egotism and exploitation. The immediate aftermath also revealed the business complexities of his legacy. With multiple bands, solo albums, and collaborations spanning nearly 5 decades, the rights to his music were scattered across different labels and ownership structures. His widow, Wendy, became the guardian of his artistic legacy, working to ensure that future releases would maintain the quality standards Ronnie had insisted upon during his lifetime. The creation of the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund represented a fitting tribute to his memory while addressing the disease that had claimed his life. The fund's mission, supporting stomach cancer research and patient assistance, reflected Ronnie's lifelong concern for others and his belief in using whatever influence he possessed to make positive changes in the world. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were there deeper forces at work? While conspiracy theories inevitably emerged around any beloved public figure's death, the reality was both more mundane and more tragic. The stomach cancer that killed him likely resulted from a lifetime of touring stress, irregular eating habits, and the general toll that a career in rock music takes on the human body. More interesting than conspiracy theories were the questions about what might have been. Demo recordings and lyric sheets found after his death suggested Ronnie was exploring more personal themes while maintaining the fantasy imagery that had defined his career. The loss of this final artistic statement represents one of rock music's great what-ifs. 10 years after his death, Ronnie James Dio's influence on heavy metal remains unmistakable and ever-growing. The devil horn sign appears at every metal concert, often made by fans who may not know its origin but understand its meaning. Defiance in the face of darkness, unity among the misunderstood, protection for dreamers in a hostile world. His vocal style continues to influence new generations of singers, and his fantasy-based lyrics have inspired countless bands to explore mythological themes in their own work. But his most important legacy transcends music entirely. Ronnie James Dio proved that physical size has no bearing on the magnitude of someone's impact on the world. He demonstrated that fantasy and reality aren't opposites but complementary ways of understanding human experience. Most importantly, he showed that maintaining authenticity and artistic integrity in a compromise-heavy industry isn't just possible. It's essential for long-term artistic satisfaction and cultural impact. The boy from Cortland who learned protective gestures from his Italian grandmother became a global phenomenon who gave millions of people their own protective gesture against the darkness. The student who was mocked for his size became the teacher who showed others that true strength comes from within. The dreamer who escaped into fantasy worlds became the guide who helped others find magic in their own lives. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Dio's legacy lies in how he redefined what it means to be a hero in the modern age. Unlike the traditional rock star mythology of excess and self-destruction, Ronnie created an alternative narrative, one where the hero's journey involved lifting others up rather than tearing oneself down. His concerts weren't just performances. They were communal rituals where thousands of people could experience their own transformation from ordinary individuals into part of something mythical and powerful. The annual Ride for Ronnie motorcycle run, which raises funds for cancer research while celebrating his musical legacy, has become more than just a charity event. It represents the living embodiment of his philosophy, that communities can come together to battle real-world dragons like disease and despair. Participants don't just ride for Ronnie. They ride as Ronnie would have wanted them to, united in purpose, defiant against tragedy, determined to transform grief into positive action. The influence of his approach extends far beyond heavy metal, modern fantasy literature. Video games and films continue to draw inspiration from the archetypes he established in his lyrics. The concept of the small hero facing impossible odds, armed only with determination and inner strength, has become a recurring theme in popular culture. From Harry Potter to countless video game protagonists, the DNA of Dio's mythology can be traced through decades of storytelling. His impact on the actual practice of heavy metal performance remains equally significant. The theatrical elements he brought to the genre, elaborate stage sets, costume changes, storytelling between songs, helped establish metal as a form of total entertainment rather than just musical performance. Bands like Iron Maiden, Blind Guardian, and countless others have built upon the foundation he laid, creating increasingly sophisticated productions that treat audiences as participants in epic narratives rather than passive consumers. The devil horn's gesture itself has transcended its musical origins to become a universal symbol of resilience and rebellion. It appears in political protests, sporting events, and social movements worldwide, often used by people who have never heard Dio's music but intuitively understand its meaning. This transformation of a personal family tradition into a global symbol of defiance represents perhaps his most lasting achievement, the democratization of heroism, making the tools of empowerment available to anyone willing to raise their hand and make the gesture. Today, when metalheads raise their horns at concerts worldwide, they're participating in a ritual that connects them to something larger than entertainment. They're acknowledging that music can be transformative, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, and that the dreams we pursue in our youth can sustain us throughout our entire lives. The streaming era has introduced Dio's music to generations who never saw him perform live. Yet his influence on these new listeners remains profound. Young musicians discovering Holy Diver for the first time still report the same transformative experience that audiences felt in the 1980s. The sense that someone understands what it feels like to be different, to dream bigger than your circumstances, to refuse to accept that small means insignificant. Ronnie James Dio didn't just sing about conquering dragons, he became the dragon slayer himself, showing millions of others that they too possess the weapons necessary to fight their own battles. His voice may have been silenced, but his message echoes louder than ever. Stand up and shout, raise your horns against the darkness, and remember that dreamers never truly die. the small man who cast a giant shadow, the voice that turned whispers into thunder, the protector who transformed his grandmother's gesture into a global symbol of hope and defiance. These are the legacies of Ronnie James Dio. In death, he became what he had always been in his music, immortal, inspiring, and proof that the human spirit, when properly focused, can indeed move mountains and slay dragons. What hidden secrets might still remain in the vaults of his recordings, in the memories of those who knew him best, in the continuing evolution of the culture he helped create? Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, adding to rather than diminishing the legend. But one thing is certain. As long as there are dreamers who feel small in a big world, as long as there are people who need to believe in magic and heroism, the voice of Ronnie James Dio will continue to thunder across the darkness, reminding us all that we can be our own heroes in the epic story of our lives.